I was described as fondling ArenaNet's balls yesterday because I'm having so much fun in the expansion and sharing it with you all online. We're going to do more of that today. So this is day 3. I've had another 6 to 7 hours of playtime this time around. I actually think the numbers are a bit higher than that, honestly, because my 24-hour birthday booster, which I popped, just expired before recording this video. But of the meaningful game time, it was around another 6 to 7. And in terms of the story now and exploration, I'm roughly halfway through in terms of map completion, the 3rd map, and I'm at the beginning of Act 3 of the story. So a good majority of the story I've now completed. As ever, it's still going strong. I would say it hasn't increased in quality over yesterday's stuff. Yesterday's stuff was really good. And I've definitely realized I'm going to have a big spoiler-wide geek out in a video with all of you all once I finish it myself, which hopefully will just be a couple of days now. I was going to withhold all my story discussion until I start doing a proper run-through like I would with Living World episodes, but no, we can't wait. We're going to have to talk about this, and hopefully pretty soon. The fact that it didn't get even better than yesterday isn't a slight in any way. It was just incredibly good yesterday, and it's been incredibly good still. So yeah, talking about the Riverlands, which is the majority of what this video is going to be on, I'm about halfway done, 50% in terms of map completion, but in terms of actually visiting everywhere and unfogging places, I have genuinely experienced most of it, not in any kind of real depth, not as much with a fine toothbrush as I could have on the 2nd map especially, and I think that's because once again map 3 is a lot more horizontal, but one thing has become clear to me. So where I am in the expansion now is about the equivalent of being mostly done with Tangled Depths from Heart of Thorns. You know, if this was Heart of Thorns, just to give you guys a bit of perspective, I'd basically be done now in terms of traditional exploration before we start looking at endgame things and earning money to get bigger bags and to get ascended weapons and whatever stuff Guild Wars 2 players like to go for, right? I'd be pretty much done for that traditional exploration, and one of Heart of Thorns' biggest criticism from casual players was that it didn't offer enough. I think that when I look then, immediately it's evident Path of Fire kind of resolved this, because now for POF, I'm not mostly done. I have 2 full maps to go through, and some of you guys might be thinking, well, what about Dragon Stand, Wood and Potatoes? That place was explorable too. That's true, but in terms of traditional exploration, it wasn't exactly a regular map, was it? I mean, we could map complete it and go walk over and ding POIs and vistas, but it really revolved around that meta. It was very gated, and it was quite limited. We had like 1 story instance in the entire thing. There was no sort of real meat to it, and I got 2 full more maps of that. Speaking of this thing with Dragon Stand and the idea of having a big meta, I've also noticed here on day 3 the first murmurings from people who have sped their way through the whole thing and rushed like mad. The first murmurings that maybe one of Path of Fire's biggest failings could be that it lacks big metas. Now, I've not seen all the maps yet. I will trust people when they say this, though. It sounds like they didn't do a Dragon Stand style map, which maybe is a bit of a shame to some of you, maybe a good thing to some of you. But also, in addition to not doing that, it doesn't seem like Path of Fire is offering any real version of the Geraint, of Verdant Brink Nighttime, or of Tyria, and especially Tyria and the Geraint. I very much enjoyed from HOT. So it seems like PFF may have lacked on that. It seems like ArenaNet might have swung from one extreme to the other. I very much stand by people who say that a variety is what's best with stuff like this. Now, there are meta events in these maps, and in fact, I did a stream of one of them, the very first map, the Amnoon Oasis, where you run around gathering casino coins, but these things don't seem to be scaled for large groups, whatever. When I did that on stream, we had like 100 people running around, and we smashed it. Like, it would ask for 250 coins to be collected in one phase of this big event, and we got 2,000. You don't really need to understand how the event works right now to know that if we got 2,000 when it was only asking for 250, these things aren't organized in the same way as these mega bosses and encounters were during the Heart of Thorns days. So I don't know whether I care that if there's not a Dragon Stand style map, but I do think it will be a bit of a shame if the last maps don't have anything remotely like those HOT experiences, and I guess there's a chance that they will. It's just we haven't seen much of it. And in fact, I've got a really awesome meta event that I want to talk to you guys about today that takes place in the Riverlands. Back to this discussion of how big it feels and, you know, comparing it to HOT. Another thing's occurred to me at this point that I've spent so many hours now with all of this content is how pointless a lot of my early commentary and speculations have been. Like, I did a stream, okay, talking about the teleporter mastery point in the demos. So in the demo, there's a mastery point where you speak to a ghost and he says, oh, back in the first game, essentially, he describes it in terms of years, but he says, many years ago, we used to have these teleporters everywhere and you'd run around and you'd activate them and then it would trigger the TP. Do you want to do it for old time's sake? And you'd play his little challenge and it would be there and done and dusted. And I remembered saying, oh, this sucks that, you know, this doesn't actually teleport us. It was great and it was a fun callback, but it doesn't teleport us. Maybe they could have improved on that. And then, you know, went out on my merry way. I genuinely expected that in all of Path of Fire, that was going to be the only callback we'd have to those teleporters in the whole expansion. I guess my expectations were quite low. Turns out, in the third map, loads of these return. And they're just like the GW1 style. When they're not attached to mastery points or anything, you legitimately just walk in, trigger them, you go up to the switches, you activate them in a certain order, and they teleport you to other places. I've seen at least 2 of them. Some of them are one-way, some of them are two-way. They'll get you high, they'll get you low. What a great little thing. And I'm really curious when that shaman updates his historical guide to Tyria, whether they perfectly align with the positions of the old teleporters back in GW1. And so that's been great. That blew me out of the water because I didn't think it was going to happen. And now it just makes me realize, yeah, I had a lot of weird comments like that. On the downside with mastery points, a place where the game has started to disappoint me a little. My first experience with the demo, we got these interesting mastery points, especially one with a chef, where you get this special little health bar and you got to throw ingredients to the chef and there's a crying assistant in the corner. It generally was really fun. I was hoping that because they had more time on Path of Fire, that most masteries would be like this. Heart of Thorns had a few equivalents as well, like where you had to eat the boar meat and stuff. And there are some interesting mastery points like that in PoF. Like in the Riverlands, I found one where this Asura, I think it is, wants you to gather unbound magic, but it's not just right next to you. You know, you think mastery points, you walk up to it and you're going to get the mastery really quickly. No, this is a mastery point where you speak to an NPC and it basically triggers a quest that takes you across the entire map. And it's like this extra thing you're doing while exploring. You're not just looking for POIs and vistas and stuff. You're also looking for these little things to collect to get this mastery point. So they are doing some fun mastery points, like the chef one, like that one I just talked about, but not enough. Most of them are just glorified skill point hero challenge communes. And there's a lot of that copy pasting going on, more than I guess I would have wanted. Anyway, so yeah, that's generally an overview. We'll get into the Riverlands. Another thing I will say is yesterday I mentioned the hidden 5th Griffin mount. The community, the really dedicated guys who have rushed to the end, are in full force right now. The community is in full force trying to acquire this thing, and there's been a lot of guides and finally a lot of information about its acquisition is there, including YouTube videos. And the way this thing moves is ridiculous. The movement power creep, as I read in the comments, is very much real. So here's a clip from Linksy Zong's video, who I never asked explicitly for permission for, but hopefully doesn't mind me showing a few seconds of their video. If you guys want to go to it, there's a link in the description. It's only about a minute long, but look at this moving through Verdant Brink. Totally ridiculous. I'll do some proper spotlights on it in the future. I've been thinking more as well, as the Griffin has slowly more and more become the focus for a lot of people, how clever the marketing was and how it influenced the design of Path of Fire. Because what you'll notice is to get the Griffin, it costs a lot of money and it costs a lot of collection stuff. And what it's done is it's enabled the devs to inject a lot of extra playtime out of the player base just to get this Griffin. You know, if this Griffin had been marketed and sold as a regular one of the other mounts, I think we would have seen a lot of complaining online with people saying, oh, how dare they make me spend 250 gold on it? How dare they make me do this? How dare they make me do that? But what we're actually seeing in the community is everybody's generally really excited to do it because we view it as a bonus now. We view it as an extra thing. And that means, of course, that ArenaNet can keep the player base in the game for longer. And that's a powerful thing. Seeing people on mounts that you haven't got yet is a powerful thing. I can't imagine many free-to-play people out there right now not interested in picking up PoF just because it looks cool to ride around on a Raptor. So let's talk a bit more about the Riverlands and my specific experiences, as that's what these videos generally are, as well as keeping us up to date with what's going on with the game. As I said, this map is once again wider. Probably not as fun as the previous one that I did, just because I explored it a lot quicker. Maybe I'm getting a bit burnt out on going super slowly, so now I'm finding myself you know, skipping more NPCs than I used to, not standing around waiting for ambient dialogue as much as I used to, especially with enemies. I'm much more used to Weaver now. I've got a lot more of the traits that I care about, and so I'm not fighting as many mobs. I generally know how the sword feels, and some of that luster is worn off. In fact, if anything, I kind of want to play a different class right now. As much as I thought I'd enjoy Weaver, I think I really want to play a Scourge. I did a meta event where some Scourge was playing a support build, and the amount of barrier he buffed onto me was obscene. So all of a sudden I want to play these other things, but they haven't explored yet, and that's not quite doing me any favors in terms of stopping to smell the roses and kill every enemy that I find. Not that I was doing that, but it just means the exploration of this map has gone a bit quicker. It may also come down a lot to the fact that this is the Skimmer map, which requires a lot of very open, wide areas, quicksand, I guess just dunes in general, really. They're very fun to glide around on and over the top of, and watery areas, so that you can really play into what the Skimmer feels like. Like the Skimmer heart itself is a big, big, big region. So specifically, as to that mount, it took me a while to get it while I was exploring the map. So as you're traveling, you can find these little branded trenches, and I was so careful when originally playing to try and jump over and avoid touching this whenever possible, because clearly it's a thing like, oh, when you get the Skimmer, you can glide over, and that'll be a lot of fun. I was very disappointed then to realize that the brand, with these trenches that exist, if you go into them, the brand does basically no damage anyway. So that was a bit disappointing, and the reward I got for them returning to those places and gliding easily over on the Skimmer was a bit less so. I'm also starting to experience, now that I have 3 mounts, all the opportunities and different versions of getting across an area I have. Like this branded trench, I can maybe use the Springer to do kind of a big regular jump to get over it. I could use the Raptor to clear it very easily, or I could use the Skimmer when it's eventually unlocked to clear all of them without even having to press any buttons, with even more convenience, if you will. So yeah, the Skimmer was my anticipated favorite mount. I think that is still true. One thing that really struck me was how different the movement is. Now, they've all had different movements, so it should come as no surprise that this guy moves differently, but he is very floaty, especially when you get those movement speed boosts, and not in a bad way, just in an, oh, I think probably I can see myself wandering around on the Raptor by default, rather than the Skimmer. Also, just because the Raptor is so goddamn fast, I think that will be sort of the general default movement one that most people go for, unless the Griffin comes along and beats them all out, as it might well. The other cool thing about the Skimmer was it dies much better than I was expecting. I'd kind of resigned myself to thinking we'd only get minor changes, but if you use quite a striking die on the Skimmer, it can really change a lot. You get these awesome racing stripes. I went with Bloodstone Red, I think it was, in the end. And the last thing I'll say really about the Skimmer, again, is to do with the Griffin. It's interesting for me while I'm like doing these long glides and stuff on the Skimmer, because it feels very fun. It's like, yeah, I can imagine all these places where I'll constantly come back to this, but I can't help but realize every time I do that, if I was on the Griffin, I could accomplish the same thing anyway, and I wonder how I'll feel going through Living World Season 4 and just forever more in Guild Wars 2, knowing that Griffin's always going to be available when I eventually unlock it. I'm generally just interested about that. You know, there's that whole argument of flying mounts ruin MMOs, and not that this is necessarily a flying mount, but I wonder to what degree those discussions will become relevant for Guild Wars 2, and already, you know, most MMOs, they release with mounts, and then as many years later, they have the flying mount discussion. Guild Wars 2 might have kind of just pushed us into a position where it's all come at once. Again, I know it doesn't actually fly, but it is very fast, and it can approximate it as far as Guild Wars 2's content is often concerned. So, other things to talk about the map. This map is a treat for lore. A lot of people had been telling me online over the previous VODs, WP, I can't wait for you to get to the next map, and even beyond, people are saying. We'll see about that. But I can understand why. The NPC dialogue is like turned up to 11. It's like a different team made this map, it almost feels like. Everyone has something to say. Even random vendors that you just go to sell your wares, you can get, you know, 2 or 3 clicks worth of dialogue out of.
You'll miss my going on a business. Don't stray too far from the camp.
We're gonna play heroes and go through the trials.
All right, dear. Stick together and be back by moonrise.
And they set that up instantly. This map also has more hearts than any other, and I think that contributes to this. But each heart has lots of NPCs around. The first one even has a component to it where you can break these urns that release Earth Djinn. And the Earth Djinn are friendly and nice, and they'll converse with you about ancient times and Guild Wars 1 events and stuff that then you can be quizzed on and see if you can get the answers to. Some of you might recall that Heart of Thorns did the same thing in Rata Novus with those terminals, and so many people loved that, but it was super optional. Well, now it's on a heart, and most people, I think, will actually go and enjoy it. So there's just so much. Now, I think one of the reasons for this is that the area of the Riverlands, the northern Riverlands, very much overlap with standard Crystal Desert areas from GW1. So I had been under a fairly odd and bad impression before POF came out that the entire original Crystal Desert area, all the missions, all the explorable places, everything, I'd been under the impression that that was all contained within the first map. And that had been something that was disappointing me and openly disappointing me. I talked about it a few times. I was very concerned that, you know, when you play the Crystal Desert in Guild Wars 1, it feels huge. You get a lot of playtime out of it. And then the thought that just a single Guild Wars 2 map, no matter how big, would have all of that, and then you just race around on it and mount at insane speeds. I was very much familiar with the scale of Guild Wars 2 feeling smaller than the scale of Guild Wars 1, maybe owing partly to movement speed, obviously, of characters, the requirement to stop and face all combat, also the way that the in-game art map worked compared to the Guild Wars 2 one. One gives you a much greater impression of the world. So I was very familiar with this, and I was worried that one of my favorite regions was going to be an exaggerated example of something that I already didn't like. So I had this impression. That impression was totally wrong. You do get some Guild Wars 1 Crystal Desert areas in the first map, but then there's also places like the Salt Flats and Glint's Lair and the Tomb of the Primeval Kings in the second map, and the third map has a lot more. In fact, the third map is really the central main places and the ones that I remember the most. So this is especially where Augury Rock, for example, is located, and that was sort of the fixation point for most of your adventures back there in the original game. And that is what I want to end this video talking about today, because it was my main enjoyment yesterday. Truly fantastic. So, Augury Rock. Now, a quick recap for the people who haven't played Guild Wars 1 to know the context of this place. So, you're in the war against the Massart, and you realize they're invisible and you can't fight them, you can't do anything. The Shining Blade have just been destroyed by a great betrayal, and the Henge of Den Ravi is, has just been attacked. So, what do? Well, Vizier Kilbron says to us, listen, you guys are chosen. If you go to the Crystal Desert, you can undertake a ritual to become ascended. When you're ascended, you'll have the gift of true sight, you'll be closer to the gods. You also can go to the Crystal Desert and speak with the dragon prophet there, Glint, and using these tools, but by becoming ascended, you will now be able to see the Massarts, and you will be able to take the fight to them. Don't try and fight the Massart before you do this, you'll just be throwing your lives away. And so that's what happens in Guild Wars 1. There's like this whole arc of the story that is totally separate from the rest of the conflict, where you're in this desolate, isolated place known as the Crystal Desert, seeking ascension. And while you're there, you find out that there's all these other civilizations and people that have come here over the years, seeking that for themselves and their peoples. You know, entire cities have been built before then. The civilizations have failed to ascend, and they've been destroyed and, you know, broken back into the sand. So you're in this magical, mystical place, but it was all about ascending. And you do learn how to do it. The Forgotten, who were still alive in the Crystal Desert at the time, assist you in this. They challenge you through 3 great trials that take place in different areas of the region. You could do in any order. This was one of the rare places in Guild Wars 1 where you could choose like what order you could complete the campaign in. And once you'd finished all 3, you could go to a great mesa in the middle of the sand dunes known as Augury Rock. And with everything complete, you would stand on these platforms, it would break open and reveal this beautiful golden room with the god statues inside it. In there, you would fight a version of yourself, a doppelganger. And this was a big significant moment according to Guild Wars 1 gameplay because of how builds worked. So you had to kill an NPC that was just like you, but like hit harder and was tankier. So how do you do that? Okay, well, I'll add something that cripples him so that I can kite him around. Well, now he has added something that cripples you, so you can't kite him away. Okay, I'll add a self heal so that I can out-sustain him. Oh no, but now he's just added a self heal as well. Okay, so I'll add an interrupt to interrupt his self heal. Oh, but he's also got an interrupt and he can interrupt my self heal, and so on. You get the idea. It was a very fun part of the game. It's something that Guild Wars 2 has tried to replicate many times, but hasn't very well. I've talked about it a lot recently in videos. So, returning to the Crystal Desert in Guild Wars 2, this is the main fixation for me. I thought that the main story would have a big thing at Augury Rock. I thought that so much of the plot would revolve all around it. And indeed, some of the plot revolves around it, but honestly, not that much. It exists here in this map. So my first experience was entering the Riverlands, and immediately I noticed I was under the effects of a meta event that said Augury Rock is closed. And I was a bit concerned that this was going to be a big part of the main story, and I didn't want to experience it in the open world until I experienced it in the story. Like, the previous map had the Tomb of the Primeval Kings, which I'd explored as a part of the map, and then the story takes you to later. I want to do the story version first. So I went through, played a ton of story, and realized, oh, Augury Rock isn't actually core Guild Wars 2 story. Now, That fact that Augury Rock is not core Guild Wars 2 story could have been very concerning to me. If I'd heard that before the expansion came out, I'd been very, very worried. But I don't even care about that. The core story has done everything I wanted from Augury Rock and then some. And it's gone to other places and done other things that more than make up for this. So I'm not going to readily talk about that stuff just yet. But it's actually fine that Augury Rock wasn't in the core story. And then I got to the point where I was like, okay, yeah, let's see what they did with this meta event. And they did do it justice. It's just that it's out here in the open world. And so how does it work? Well, it all begins with an escort, where you hear about a Sylvari whose wild hunt it is to ascend, which is a brilliant idea. And you sort of follow this Sylvari around, helping them gather allies. I'm not sure because I never failed this, but it feels like this event, by the way that the dialogue works and stuff, it feels like if the Sylvari dies during this escort, it might fail completely. And the devs very rarely do that, and they haven't for years, but they did that back at the launch of the game with the Balthazar event chain in the Straits of Devastation, and that, especially with initial launch, was a really exciting component of Guild Wars 2. It was like the one true difficult event chain in the game. Can you do it? Can you get all the packed soldiers up to the temple? So they might be doing a similar thing here. I don't know. They might have just given me the impression that they were. But so you escort this NPC all the way up, and eventually it gets to the point where she has found a way to break her way inside, even though there are no Forgotten there. And you have this big, dangerous defense event now to defend her. My first time I actually hit Augury Rock, I didn't even realize I was there. You know, I mentioned earlier this idea of Guild Wars 2 stuff feeling smaller than Guild Wars 1 equivalents. Yeah, this definitely happens here. And it's amazing, actually. Like, in GW1 as well, it was a single rock out in the middle of generally desolation, as far as I remember, and not too much. It was very flat ground, and then this one mesa stood out and above, beyond all others. In this map, it kind of didn't, and I have to say, this is the one very rare place that the environment design disappointed me a bit. I would have wanted this thing to be some fuck-off honking thing in the middle, but I guess they just chose instead to stay true to what it was in the first game and keep the scales the same, which just means that things feel smaller because we can scroll our map out. And I think that that's quite a respectable thing to have gone for as well in its own right. I mean, comparing Augury Rock to the giant snow temple we went to in the previous map, you know, Augury Rock just cannot compete. But still, I was excited to get inside, and it was closed. Through the story, you learn that the brand have been targeting this place, and there's a great branded beast on the inside. And in fact, once you've finished this defense, it opens up. You're allowed to teleport inside. You use the same teleporter that you could in the first game. And if you look closely at the ground, the symbols there as well, all the set pieces are there. You take this teleporter, it takes you right inside beyond this branded wall, and you have a big boss fight. So this is where this meta could have been a bit like Terrir or whatever, the Octavine. They didn't go for that. This feels more like a random legendary you'd fight around. You know, if a ton of people pulled together to fight the giant event in Harathi Hinterlands or in Diessa Plateau. It feels like that kind of scale event. There is a lot going on. So what we're actually fighting is a branded Forgotten. I've already talked about these in one of my VODs. It's a branded Forgotten named Joso Escher. Now, Joso Escher is a character from GW1, but I say character, I use that term very loosely. Joso Escher was actually just a random monk boss you fought at the end of one of the missions, the Thirsty River. And I kind of love this. I personally love this, and I'll tell you why. I never really appreciated it when I was just a regular Guild Wars 1 player and I didn't do YouTube or anything, but the Thirsty River is actually the hardest of the 3 missions. When I started on YouTube, I played through all of Prophecies, and not only did I decide to look at the story a lot, I also decided to try and solo the entire game without ever changing my build, without ever skipping ahead, only using the skills and things as they became available to me. And this was a very difficult challenge, but the first time it really got very hard, like insanely hard, like hours and hours of prep and research to get through. The first time this was really difficult was the Thirsty River mission in the Crystal Desert. And one of the hardest things to do in that mission at the very end was to fight a random Forgotten boss named Joso Escher. and Joso Escher. There's no dialogue or any particular significance to this Forgotten. This is the Forgotten that has survived to now have a prominent role as a branded all the way forward in Guild Wars 2. And they talk about Joso a lot. A lot of, I talked about there being loads of dialogue on this map. There is loads of dialogue, and they expand on this character's story, tenfold, even more than that. What's, 10 times 0? An infinite amount more story he's now got. And this was it was something that really made me smile. They even explicitly say, some of the NPCs who are playing as the Guild Wars 1 heroes and crying out Guild Wars 1 skill names, they talk about the Thirsty River being one of the hardest trials. So yeah, that's the boss fight. He phases, and you have to fight other branded. Eventually, he's defeated, and Augury Rock becomes open for all. And you might think that's the end of the meta. It's actually not. So a lot of stuff happens now. There's items and things you can do once you're inside Augury Rock. There's lots of things to interact with. Amazingly, and this is probably what I found most fun, there's more areas you can explore now. In the first game, Christ, this video is just me constantly talking about GW1. Deal with it, guys. In the first game, there is like a big floor, and that's where you're fighting the doppelganger, but you don't do much else. You fight a doppelganger version of yourself, and then you ascend and you disappear and you go off to Glint's Lair. In GW2, you realize that there's like a catacombs underneath that you get to explore inside, and you get to talk to the Sylvari down there and some other ghosts. There's even the upper levels are now available. So two things happen, really. First, the catacombs are there. You can go down, you can get a bit of story. You find out that Ascension hasn't been possible for a long time. To really dig into why, I think I'd have to start talking about main story stuff, so I will leave that there. And you also meet some ghosts, and the ghosts talk about they're about to go on a pilgrimage. I'll come back to them in a second. Now, upstairs, all around the room, you actually find fragments, scrolls, I think they are, scripts, of the Flameseeker prophecies. Like, you actually get to read the legitimate Flameseeker prophecies, and they're all cryptic and weird, and I'm going to do a video deciphering these and talking specifically how this all works. But there's like a little mini game where you have to interact with one of them, and then it releases these lights into the room. You have to gather the lights, then return to it, and then do the next. You only have a limited time in Augury Rock, and there's like 15 of them to do. So most of them are in the lower levels, but you have to go quite high up. I never actually managed to finish it myself just yet, but you get the whole prophecy, and it's really interesting to dive into. It would just be a bit much to talk about in this video. So Augury Rock, in the end, with the way they did it in the gameplay and the events and stuff, I'm actually incredibly satisfied with how it was handled. Now, beyond this as well, you know those ghosts I mentioned? They become relevant in a second. See, when Augury Rock closes again, the meta kind of continues or goes into another phase. It's not like the Heart of Thorns metas where it's like once every 2 hours the escort to attack Augury Rock is open and then you do that and then there's nothing. There's like, it's more nuanced than that. There's other stuff happening. So when it closes, that then kicks off another series of events. Imagine when Tyria closes, that kicking off a series of events. I mean, it kind of does in Heart of Thorns because of the outposts, but you get what I mean. So instead, now what happens is when it closes, all this magic spreads out across the Riverlands, the northern areas of the Riverlands, and I'm talking a massive, massive environment. I'm talking, imagine a playable space the size of Queensdale, with all of these magical things that are thrown around all over the place. And you got to collect them all up in a certain time limit. If you successfully do this, another mechanic triggers that I don't quite understand, but it picks a random player on the map. I don't know whether it is a random player. Maybe it's the player who got the most magic. Maybe it's a player in a certain region. I don't know. But it picks a player on the map and spawns a doppelganger of them. And it broadcasts to everyone on the map, Azurik of Parathia, which is my character name, has spawned a doppelganger. And this toon will start fighting everyone, and they will act as your elite specialization or core profession, I guess, when that occurs. So it's really fascinating. You get to fight this big boss, and then finally when that is defeated, things sort of cycle back. Now, what's curious though is during that magic collection event and the doppelganger, there's another thing happening too. So those who were very eagle-eyed and spoke to the ghosts in Augury Rock in the basement might have noticed they were talking about going on a pilgrimage to the throne of Palentia, and that we could follow them if we wanted, but we have to follow them exactly. So this struck me as very curious when I was in Augury, and so even though the meta was going on, I decided to see what was happening there. And sure enough, secretly, sneakily, once the rock closes, these ghosts do go off on a walk. And as you follow them, you can start interacting with these pedestals they leave and embark on the pilgrimage with them. And you have to do it entirely in order and keep up with them the whole way. And you get to follow them along. So this is really exciting for lore too. And this has got special significance to me too also. So one of the parts of the Ascension ritual in GW1 was we were doing it alongside the ghost of Chiriosa, one of my favorite characters in the entire story, a man who saved his kingdom and then sullied and threw it all away, seeking ascension for himself and his people, and led many of them off to a miserable, horrendous, horrific death that was absolutely purposeless. A hero that completely did a 180 and screwed his own people over accidentally. That was Chiriosa. I love his story. I don't think his story necessarily needs to be expanded on, but Guild Wars 2 does do a little bit of that. See, when Chirai came to the desert, he built himself a throne at this throne of Palentia. And after his people were destroyed, there was an imposter ghost sitting upon that throne that the GW1 heroes had to go and, get off of it and reclaim it for Chirai. And so here in Guild Wars 2, you are told by these ghosts that they're going back to that throne. And if you followed them, you might even get an audience with Chirai. And if you do it, you can get that audience with Chirai. He doesn't say very much. He references Joko in contemporary Guild Wars 2. He doesn't talk about his failings or anything. But he was a big character in Guild Wars 1, the ghostly hero of Guild Wars 1. You can actually meet him. You just kind of have to do this special thing as the meta is closing down. This is of even more special importance to me because I very rarely look at the Guild Wars 2 map art, press M, and really pick up minor details. I'll look at like the Isles of Janthir and say, oh, wouldn't it be cool to go there? I'll look at the Verdant Cascades and say, oh, wouldn't it be cool to go to that delta? You guys might not have noticed, but when Path of Fire came out, they actually added Desolana, which is a region of the world we've never explored before, as a region name on the world map, as you can see here. They actually did that, so that's quite curious. I'll do stuff like that. Very rarely will I look at tiny details. Very rarely will I look at a specific little island and say, that has significance, because I'm generally cynical that the devs really are doing that. But one place I did do this was in the Crystal Desert in 2012. If you looked at the world map from way back when, and I can't even show you footage of it right now without doing a lot of Googling, you could see the River Elon, and it flowed through the desert, but there was an island on the desert. And if you looked very closely, you knew from that map art that had always been the throne of Palentia. You always knew it was. And this idea that it was because of those moats we saw in the first game that the river hadn't flooded it was always so great to me. And I suppose in my jadedness over the years, I've began to think more and more and more and drift further away that they'd ever do something with that they would ever actually become a thing. But it kind of did. And on this map, you get to go there with these ghosts and meet Chirai once again as the ghostly hero. All in the open worlds, and all totally on the table, in my opinion, to talk about spoiler-wise. So yeah, there you go. That is map 2. I also spent a little bit of time going back to the earlier maps. I did some of the mastery exploration in the first and the second. I got a point of interest in the second map. Yesterday, I said, I don't think you can get map completion. I actually could. I just had to use the Springer to jump on top of the urn, and I had about 1,000 messages from you guys explaining that to me. So thank you very much. I did get that in the end. And yeah, having the Skimmer, I went back and got all those old things that I couldn't get before, like the quicksand mastery point that we got in the demo way back when, and that beautiful cove out near the Lily of the Ellen. So yeah, that was day 3. A hell of a lot went on. I've got a lot more of the Riverlands to explore, and then it's even further south off into the Desolation for me, and I'll finally be catching up with where I saw a lot of my guildies managed to get to in a matter of, 4 or 5 hours on release day. How they rushed there that fast and why they rushed there that fast, I don't know whether I'll ever understand. But yeah, I will see you guys for a recap on that just tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. I'll see you next time.